Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning from wherever you speak. Welcome to the next session, next episode of this uh, podcast, which is very close to my heart, on the subject of accessibility and how can we make a more inclusive and a more accessible future for the digital space, especially for the persons with disabilities that NABIT serves. I have an industry veteran, someone who has extensively contributed towards making education in the United States more accessible, and in his extensive professional life, and which continues as we speak. I have the joy to introduce Scott Reddy, uh, ex head of accessibility of Verbatim, and now who runs his own enterprise. And he's my guest for the podcast today. It's such an honor having you, Scott. It's a pleasure speaking to you today.
Well,
And
thank
just for the audience, I have taken a lot of work to get him. We have had a lot of shuttling between us, and finally, I've had the pleasure to hosting him. Scott, thank you so much for consenting to be a part of this, and uh, grateful from people from NABIT and from the accessibility community for being my guest today. And a short introduction, if you could help us with about your journey in accessibility and how you've been working for the improvement of lives for the disabled back in the US. Over to you, Scott.
Awesome. Well, thank you, and welcome to the podcast here. And excited to be able to share with you some of the things that I've been doing, and hopefully it'll spark ideas and add some different dimensions to what
Mhm.
each and every one of you are doing. Give you a little bit of my background.
Yeah.
Actually, I'll start with my parents. My parents were deaf. They
Okay.
were teachers at the Missouri School for the Deaf
Okay.
and taught there. And I had the awesome privilege of actually growing up
Mhm.
on campus at the school. They
Wow.
had housing for faculty. So from
Hmm.
the age of 3 until I was 13, I actually lived on campus. So the culture, the
Wonderful.
language, the community, that was where I had the opportunity to grow up. So I had great mentors growing
Lucky
up
you.
that taught me a lot about the perception and what equitable experiences are truly about. But
Hmm.
then from there, if we focus on education, well, my parents were both teachers. My brother, my sister in law are both retired teachers. My sister has worked in the educational system.
Okay.
My wife is a teacher. And I have been a professor at a college and oversaw an interpreter training program where students were learning to become sign language interpreters.
Right.
But in addition to that, I have worked in a lot of different companies and government organizations, and also on my own in helping to bridge that gap between the world and the individual's experience in that world. So
Okay.
30 plus years of accessibility
Wow.
and in a lot of different environments. So that's a brief background of myself.
So I can safely say that teaching and education runs in the blood. It's across the family. It's been there for generations, and yeah, it's rare to find such a combination of people who have so enriching experience working in this space. Um, you just amplified the pleasure for interviewing you, Scott.
Oh, well, thank you. It is a great combination because if you've not been in the educational space yourself, it's hard to fully understand the academic culture and
Absolutely.
the way that academic organizations operate.
Hmm. So I ask you this question, Scott, because especially in the developing world, education unfortunately is not accessible for all, and there's a huge attrition. There's a huge dropout rate which happens eventually, and it's to do not with the lack of intent, but the lack of inaccessibility of the education content. So that's a challenge which we are facing here. But across your experience of plus 30 years, as you mentioned, of making educational content accessible, uh, what how has the experience shaped your approach to addressing these challenges, and what has been the major challenges that you have faced in making education accessible back in the US? If you could shed some light to that.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great question, and you are exactly right. It is still a challenge in creating an equitable experience for students in education.
Hmm.
And if I were to say what was the primary challenge that I see is that education still approaches accessibility from a reactionary stand, from a reactionary approach. So, what do I
Hmm.
mean by that? Students have to disclose that they have a disability
Right.
here in the United States. They have to work with a counselor for accommodations. And then oftentimes those accommodations are not provided until the
Mm.
student makes that department aware that they need accommodations. So for example, a student goes into a classroom. The
Right.
professor or the teacher shows a video that's not captioned. Then
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
video, the student goes to the disability services, says that
Hmm.
video was not captioned. The video then is collected and sent off to be captioned.
Right.
That takes 2 or 3 days. So
Mm.
there ends up being a week or so
Correct.
between when the classroom had the video shown
Correct.
and the student receives the video back with captions.
Correct.
That
Correct.
reactionary period does not provide that student that equitable experience. Because during that week, there's been quizzes, there's been discussions, there's been a lot of things that have taken place.
Correct.
Whereas if education, the academic institutions could get ahead of this and be proactive,
Right.
create all of their content to be accessible,
Hmm.
create documents that are accessible,
Right.
create everything that's digital to be accessible so that students, when they enter into the classroom, they have access. I'm going to use
Right.
an example here. I oftentimes like to go back to the physical environment.
Right.
If the university's library had steps but did
Hmm.
not have a ramp, would
Correct.
they expect a student who uses a wheelchair to sit outside of the library for a week
Hmm.
waiting for a ramp to be built before they could enter into the library and use the services? No, that would be absolutely absurd. People would
Absolutely.
be outraged. They would be upset. They would protest against that because the student that uses a wheelchair didn't have access to the library. But
Makes
yet,
sense.
it's acceptable when we're talking about digital accessibility. And it shouldn't
Mm.
be. It
Absolutely.
shouldn't be.
No,
So
yeah, please.
making that transition from being reactionary to being proactive is one of the major shifts that needs to take place and one of the key challenges. Were you going
No.
to ask something
Mhm.
additional?
So, something which the notion of not accessibility is outrageous, for the lack of a better word. And what happens is that the other problem is that it cannot be, a number-driven game. So even if it's 2% of persons with disabilities, and we say that it's just a problem for a mere percentage, right? So let's overlook it.
Right.
I think that's absolutely wrong because it's not about those 2%. It's just about many others who know about non accessibility, who at enrollment do not participate in admissions, right? Because they are aware that the accessibility is lacked. So it may be a percentage problem. It may be just say 1%, 80%, or whatever. If you're excluding one, it's not just that one who's affected. There are many like him who was not given the platform. And if we have not given the platform and we devoid someone, I think we have not just devoid him, we have devoid the whole generation access to those resources. And that's outrageous, to say the least.
That's exactly right. And to add to that, if I go back to my ramp example,
Correct.
okay, maybe you have 1% of students that use a wheelchair, but have you ever pushed a stroller or had a cart or a suitcase and you've chosen to use the ramp? the ramp actually serves not just that small percentage of individuals who would use a wheelchair, it actually
Right.
serves a much larger percentage of the general population.
Makes sense. Makes absolute sense. And continuing from there, I think there's a lot to be done in that space, especially from education. I think the freedom to economic independence, the journey starts from making a person educated and giving him enough and more opportunities, basis his intent and commitment to go ahead and study to the extent that he or she would want to. And
Right.
denying that basic right is something which I think shouldn't happen at all, even if it's for the smallest percentage who may be affected.
That's right.
It can be, attrition or not participating should be a choice. It should not be forced on someone. Unfortunately, that's what's happening.
Exactly. And a second key challenge within the academic environment is that oftentimes the accommodations is only focused on the classroom environment.
Yeah.
And when you go to school, have it
Hmm.
be, elementary or even higher ed in colleges and universities, there's so much more that takes place than just
Right.
within the classroom. And the student needs to be able to have access to everything that's taking place within the entire student life cycle. And oftentimes, everything outside of the classroom is ignored and not
Mhm.
provided access to,
Correct.
which really limits that student's ability to participate and feel a part of that educational experience.
Makes sense. Continue from there, Scott, and something. Let's talk from an optimistic standpoint. Some
Yes.
success stories or some initiatives that you have worked on, and where technology has played an enabler. Because I am a very big proponent of the idea that scalability and affordability is something which is possible only if technological play is looked into. So, can you share some success stories or initiatives that you have worked with in the past? And has there been an element of technology which has helped in building affordability and building scale to that initiative?
Absolutely. Well, I've been very fortunate in that I've had the opportunity to partner with colleges and universities across the globe
Okay.
in establishing a comprehensive accessibility strategy. And it's been really rewarding to see these institutions take those next steps. And
Okay.
it's a journey. It's not a project. It's not something that you just fix it and then you're done. It's an ongoing journey. And as you mentioned, technology keeps developing and getting better and better. And new technologies are introduced, such as now with artificial intelligence. How
Mhm.
does that come in and impact accessibility? So I've been very fortunate in being able to see throughout my career a true improvement, although I'll be the first one to admit, not fast enough. I mean,
Okay.
here in the United States, the laws have been here since 73 and 1990. So 1973 and 1990 was a long, long time ago.
Hmm.
And I would have liked to have seen much further progress than what we have. But
Sure.
the laws are truly just establishing the base.
Hmm. Okay.
When we're talking about an
Hmm.
equitable experience cannot be achieved by just meeting the letter of the law. And
Correct.
there have been academic institutions that have truly taken this to heart and said, I
Hmm.
want that student to have that has a disability to have an equitable experience as all other students on this
Right.
campus. And they have instigated policy and procedures in order for that student to have that experience.
Hmm.
A little bit about the technology that you mentioned.
Hmm.
You know, oftentimes technology that's used in accessibility is really only as good as the environment that technology is used in. So, for
Right.
example, a screen reader. A screen
Hmm.
reader is fantastic technology. It reads what's
Correct.
on your screen, it reads documents. But if that document or that screen is not formatted correctly,
Hmm.
then the technology can't be successful.
Right. Right.
Same thing with
Absolutely.
captions. Captions is a great technology,
Correct.
but if the caption isn't able to hear the speaker because the
Mm.
environment's not been set up correctly,
Makes sense.
then the technology is not going to work correctly.
Right. Right.
So it's
Right.
really they both have to work together in order for the technology to be successful.
So, Scott, I asked this from an implementation standpoint. And again, I understand you have been involved in the cycle of getting the buy in to the strategies which are suggested from universities. And often the hesitation, or should we rather say the inertia to change, would be something which might prevent many. And I asked this from a standpoint of scaling rather than just theoretically proposing solutions. So what has been the strategies which have worked best in the US to, or in your experience across the globe that you've worked in, to promote organizations to buy into this idea and make the necessary changes? If you could shed some light to that.
Absolutely. Well, the first step is that it has to be an initiative that has the leadership support.
Okay.
That's critical. If the president of the institution, the headmaster, whoever is lead in that leadership position, maybe also the board that is governing over the organization, the institution, there has to be support in order for it to be successful. The reason why is because it's going to take money. It's going to take resources. It's
Correct.
going to take prioritization of accessibility within that organization for it to be successful. But from there, it really requires a cultural shift.
Correct.
Historically, within education,
Hmm.
they have pointed to a specific office and said, this office is responsible for accessibility.
Correct.
The shift has to move from that office to everybody in that organization. If I'm a professor, if I'm a teacher, and I create a document for the students,
Right.
I have to be responsible for making sure that that document is accessible.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So there has to be that cultural shift, that adoption throughout that organization of making accessibility a priority. I've got one story. I was very, very fortunate to partner with a university here in the United States called
Yeah.
Virginia Tech.
Okay.
And Virginia Tech started with a team that said, we want this institution to be accessible, not just meet the letter of the law, but truly provide equitable experiences to everybody that comes in contact with the university. So they put together a communication plan, a plan that they became the change agents to infuse accessibility into their culture. Their communication plan included banners, included posters, and it also included stickers like this that said, keep calm, caption on. So everybody's laptops, as they would open up their laptop, this sticker would be on the back of their laptop.
Okay.
So people started asking, well, what's this caption on?
Hmm.
The chief technology officer had the sticker on the back of his laptop. As he would go into leadership meetings, the leadership would say, what's this? Keep calm and caption on. So it became a conversation that it started to infuse the entire organization. And then the pandemic hit. Education started to be delivered remotely. The president, because he was aware of keep calm and caption on, made it a mandate that we will caption all of our live environments so that when people come and have access, that the live environments will be captioned. So it came from the top because a team did the cultural
Right.
infusion, the leadership adopted it and funded it and provided the ability for them to execute. So they set
Makes
up the policy and procedures, and throughout the organization,
sense.
captioning started being offered. That was a beautiful example of how an institution can truly become more and more accessible. It's one step at a time, it's a journey. How can
Right.
they infuse that and become more accessible? Now, are there other areas that they're looking at? Absolutely, because there's more
Mhm.
than just captioning. But that was
Mhm.
one of the first areas that they started with. And it was a beautiful story of how that happened at Virginia Tech.
No, absolutely. And I see that, accessibility, especially in India, is beyond just a buzzword. There's a lot of adoption which is happening. And hopefully, um, the future is quite bright for the persons with disabilities here, because it's a match of intent and something, and also of course the availability of resources isn't the biggest problem now here in India, and people are getting conscious to the needs of persons with disabilities, especially in the universities and colleges. But just to put for the audience, if we could statistically, or let's say put a number to it, as a percentage of the cost of development, if we had to factor for the cost of making accessible uh, the content, what would tentatively be the price? I understand it's just a ballpark. And the second question would be that what should be the time commitment that a college should be, should factor for, before which they can say that we are at least at some good place, maybe not the end of the horizon, but some good place with our accessibility efforts.
Arjun, that's a great question.
Hmm.
And when we look at that question, it really depends. And I hate that
Okay.
answer of it really depends, but it really does depend on the size of the organization. How
Right.
large is the institution? How small is the institution?
Hmm.
What are the first steps in this journey that that institution is going to take?
Hmm.
What is the strategic plan of this organization when it
Correct.
comes to accessibility? And the question that you ask
Hmm.
really reflects the importance of having somebody that understands how this is to be accomplished and can
Correct.
put that strategic plan in place, attach a budget to it as to the cost of what this is going to cost,
Hmm.
and really be able to see this executed within the organization. The
Yeah.
challenge is that oftentimes there are not those that level of expertise within the institution to do this.
Agreed.
So, going back to the very beginning of our podcast here, that's one of the reasons why I set up my own company,
Yeah.
was because I wanted to see organizations be able
Hmm.
to put together a strategic plan that is going to be successful, that is going to be able to move them to the next level of
Hmm.
accessibility and see success from this.
That's exactly the reason why I asked this, because what happens is that uh, talks, if not cumulated to action, uh, they lose steam beyond a
That's
point.
right.
And the intent behind asking me this question was that somebody in the audience tomorrow, say a university dean or a professor who's a part of the audience, goes back and says, "Let's talk about this within the organization. Let's get the ball moving." Uh, it gets, and I understand it is dependent on the scale of the organization. How many students are we talking about, and starting taking a step back, it's whether we have the intent for it to push this through. But the two things which were stuck up with was that tentatively what should we budget for, and what should be the time before which we can talk about being at some place. But I understand we can park that question for later, and we can come back to it maybe as we get the interest from the audience, and as people will come back. And that leads me to the next question around Elevate Access. I think that's the name of the organization that you've just recently started, and big congrats for that
Well, thank
as you
you.
work this journey. Uh, tell me, what was the intent behind going as a solo entrepreneur, starting your own accessibility initiative, and the factors to which you'll be working? Is it going to be just consulting organizations, or also will it be more hands-on towards making educational content accessible yourself? So, what is the extent of your engagement that you have in mind in this new initiative?
Great question. Thank you for allowing me to share. It is really exciting. And the reason why I established Elevate Access is because there are a lot of organizations out there that want to have a strategic plan, that want to make a impact on becoming more accessible, but they're not sure where to start. They might not have the funds to add a leadership position to their organization. And just adding a person isn't always necessarily the answer, because they're not sure how to utilize that person. So because of all of these factors and because of the years of experience that I've seen, I've decided to set up my own organization so that I can go in and work with institutions, work with companies, work with organizations to set up that initial plan to become accessible. From that initial plan, then we're going to take a look at how much is it going to cost? What are the resources that are needed? What is the impact that we're wanting to make? Being able to truly set up a plan that is going to help them to know how best to resource accessibility. The time to start is now. There's no better time to start than right now. And we are already, as you had mentioned, seeing so many students that have not had an equitable experience. Unfortunately, here in the United States, it comes down to lawsuits. Here in the United States,
Right.
we are very attuned to the litigation process in order to mandate accessibility. It doesn't have to get to that. It doesn't have to go to a lawsuit when
Correct.
we can come together, develop that plan, and show our intent on growing and becoming more accessible. So that's the reason why I put this together and launched out on my own.
Sure.
If my parents had the opportunity to receive an education that was an equitable education, they could have been much further along in their careers as teachers, but they weren't afforded that opportunity. So I've got that intrinsic motivation also, that I want to see this happen because it needs to happen.
Correct. No, absolutely agree. And beyond the intent, what do you think are the compliance of the legal obligations that a university should have globally towards its students? And litigations happening or not happening, that's a separate issue. But speaking more from an ethical standpoint, what would be the bottom line of expectations?
I love that question. And the answer is really a very simple answer.
Sure.
Is a student with a disability having an equitable experience as all the rest of the students?
Absolutely. 0-1 answer from them.
That's the answer. Is it an equitable experience? As you had mentioned, there's technology that enables students to have an equitable experience. There are modifications that can be taken. There are approaches that can be taken that provide students an equitable experience. And you know what's even more exciting than just providing an equitable experience is that it enhances that experience for all students.
Okay.
Captions, for example, are not just used by students who are deaf or hard of hearing. If you are in public transportation, and you're riding a
Mhm.
bus, for example, and it's really
Right.
noisy and you can't hear, but you can read the captions.
Right. Absolutely.
And so those accommodations, those provisions that are viewed as accommodations, truly enhance the experience for all your students.
Hmm. No, absolutely. And I say this from a standpoint of guilt. Um, the lack of accessibility for many in the generations that have gone by has been the reason for why they could not pursue their choice of careers and profession.
Yes,
And let's say that we never opened the gates for them. We kept the gates shut intentionally. And
right.
that's a guilt for us to carry because we never gave them the equitable future that they rightfully deserved. And that's the unfortunate truth that we need to face. Right?
You're exactly right. And just think what a valuable contribution each
Sure.
individual can be to society if they have the ability to obtain that education that's needed.
Absolutely. And the next question would be, where should be the starting point for an institution? Let's say, and is there potentially any risk that their legacy systems or their content, which is already available, would that be jeopardized? So, say, for example, I'm the dean of a university. Should I worry about my systems crashing, my legacy systems getting affected, my programs that are running online should get jeopardized? Uh, if you had to soothe my nerves, what would be your response to that?
If I understand the question correctly, the first step would be to contact somebody like myself,
Okay.
somebody that's been in the field, that has the proven record of having done this in the past.
Hmm.
Consult with them, bring them on, and help to advise the next steps. There's
Okay.
nothing more frustrating than going out on a path that's never been charted before and
Right.
trying to figure out how to navigate this process.
Hmm.
And you end up making a lot of mistakes, end up being very frustrated when having a guide that can come along and guide you on this journey can really provide a much better and cost savings experience.
Right.
Now, the other aspect of this about other systems crashing, um, I do not know of any other systems that have ever crashed because
Okay.
of establishing a more accessible or an inclusive environment.
Okay. So by systems crashing, what I meant was that, say, would my website function differently, or would it be having a downtime which may affect the experience of the rest of my students? Should I factor for that, or is going to be a seamless experience wherein I am also including those excluded whilst not disturbing the apple cart?
Gotcha. Yes. No, the way that I approach it is that the improvements, the remediation of websites or content is an ongoing process.
Right.
And we will take components of that. For example, if you have images that do not have alt tags,
Right.
we will start identifying what those images are, adding
Hmm.
alt tags to them so that it's an ongoing development rather than taking down the website and then bringing up a new website. Now,
Okay.
if the website, for example, has major navigational issues,
Hmm.
then another website might need to be designed. But
Okay.
again, if there's navigational issues because of accessibility, it's navigational issues for everybody.
Correct. Correct.
So it again, on the path of making uh, digital environments more accessible doesn't necessarily mean that they have to come down in order for it to be on this journey of becoming more accessible.
So can I safely make the statement that business as usual will continue,
It
and
will continue.
it will continue, and only upgrades or improvements is what we can see in terms of having the excluded also being able to participate. As for what's happening, that goes as status quo. That won't change. I think I'm correct in my statement.
Exactly.
Perfect. And then for the last question for the day, given the time constraint, and I've taken a lot of time of yours, but before we wrap up the interview, Scott, for the listeners who are interested in getting involved in learning more accessibility in education, do you have any recommendation of resources which they can, you know, reach out to or read from? Uh, because there's this huge interest amongst persons with disabilities and likewise amongst others to take up accessibility as a profession for the future. Your comments to that?
Absolutely. Well, there's a lot of information out there, and sometimes the information is overwhelming because
Right.
there's almost too much information out there,
Right.
and some information will state one thing, and another information will state something
Mhm.
different, and
True.
so um, again, I have some resources that I will share with you, but
Perfect.
again, to be able to understand these resources, it's
Hmm.
always best to have somebody that knows how to apply those resources to that specific organization or that institution. Because
Okay.
within academic environments, there's a culture. There's each university is different from another university. And
Hmm.
even though they're all teaching education, providing education, there's still a difference within those universities, depending on the type of university that they are. But some of the resources that are really good for you to go to would be
Hmm.
an organization, and their website is very powerful. It's called AHEAD,
Okay.
AHEAD, and this
Right.
stands for Association on Higher Education and Disability.
Okay.
So AHEAD is a great resource for
Hmm.
organization for institutions for education to go to.
Right.
Another resource that is focused on the education of children is the
Hmm.
Council for Exceptional Children.
Hmm.
So Council for Exceptional Children, that's a great resource to go to for teaching the younger children. And then also, I always like to mention this last resource in that it addresses universal design. Universal design is really, if you're not familiar with that term, really
Hmm.
originated in the architectural environment,
Okay.
in creating buildings and physical environments that are designed in order to meet the needs of various individuals. Now, they have taken that and they've applied universal design into education. And this
Hmm.
organization is called CAST, CAST.
Okay.
And if you Google CAST and universal design, you'll be able to
Hmm.
go right to their website. They have a lot of resources for educational institutions, both primary and higher ed, that are great to look at and to understand how you can design your content, your environment, the way that you assess, the way that you deliver content in a way that really meets the needs of all of your students.
Right. Right. So to conclude, um, if you want to make your university ready, reach out to Scott Reddy and start the journey for accessibility. That's what would be my parting words. And before we leave, Scott, what's your message for the need for accessibility? Yes, you've spoken a lot, but what would be your the parting knock to this?
Well, there's no better time than right now.
Right,
We
absolutely.
have we have individuals that are desiring the opportunity to obtain education.
Hmm.
and we need to be there to tear down the barriers in order for them to have access.
Absolutely. On that note, thank you so much, Scott. It was enlightening speaking to you, and my audience goes back richer with a lot more information. And I hope that for those universities and those colleges who might have an interest to make their infrastructure not just their classrooms but also the digital assets accessible, we'll have more interest coming in from them, and look forward to working together if we get this opportunity.
Same here. Feel free to reach out to me, email me, contact me on LinkedIn. And I look forward to being able to help create a more accessible world.
That's what we all dream about. Thank you
Yes.
so much, Scott. Such a pleasure
Thank
speaking.
you.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.